The morning sun cast long shadows across the streets of Millbrook as a dark blue Honda Civic cruised through the quiet neighborhoods. Behind the wheel sat the town's soon-to-be police commissioner, though nobody knew it yet. He'd left behind a distinguished career in internal affairs in Chicago, trading the bustling city streets for this smaller community that seemed peaceful on the surface. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching parents walk their kids to school and shopkeepers flip their Kilos D signs to open. The decision to spend a month living here before officially taking office wasn't a requirement. It was his choice. He wanted to understand the heart of this community, to see how the police force really operated when they thought nobody was watching. His apartment was modest, just a one-bedroom unit above the local bookstore. The rent was reasonable, and the location gave him a perfect view of Main Street, where patrol cars regularly passed by. He'd decorated it minimally, just a few books, his laptop, and some comfortable furniture. The landlord had raised an eyebrow at his profession when he filled out the rental application, listing himself as a government employee, rather than revealing his true position. That morning, like every morning since he'd arrived, he followed his routine. He dressed in casual clothes, nothing that would make him stand out. Just jeans, a plain t-shirt, and comfortable sneakers. His police badge and credentials stayed locked in his desk drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief his grandmother had given him years ago. It reminded him of why he'd chosen this path, to make real change from the inside. Living undercover wasn't exactly fun, but it was eye-opening. He noticed how some officers lingered longer near certain neighborhoods, how their patrol patterns seemed to focus on specific areas where minority residents lived. He kept a small notebook, jotting down observations, patrol car numbers, times, patterns of behavior. His years in internal affairs had taught him to watch for the subtle signs of systemic issues. The local diner became his morning spot. He'd sit at the counter, order eggs and toast, and listen to the conversations around him. The waitress, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, always called him Han and made sure his coffee cup stayed full. Other regulars began to recognize him, offering small nods of acknowledgement. He heard their stories, complaints about unfair tickets, tales of being followed by patrol cars, accounts of random stops that didn't seem random at all. What struck him most was how people had simply accepted these behaviors as normal. They'd developed their own survival strategies, taking longer routes to avoid certain intersections, making sure to drive exactly at the speed limit, keeping their hands visible when police cars passed by. It wasn't right, and it wasn't the kind of policing he believed in. His phone buzzed. Another email from headquarters about his upcoming role. They were eager to have him start, to make announcements and hold press conferences. But he knew that real change required understanding, and understanding required patience. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in Chicago, where rushing to implement policies without grasping the full picture had often led to resistance and failure. Looking out his apartment window that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, he felt both determination and apprehension. The town of Millbrook was about to change, but first, he needed to experience what ordinary citizens experienced. He needed to feel what they felt, see what they saw, and understand their fears and frustrations firsthand. Little did he know that tomorrow would bring his first encounter with the very officers who would soon learn a powerful lesson about judging people based on appearances. As he prepared for bed, organizing his notes from the day, he couldn't help but smile slightly at what was to come. Sometimes the best lessons in life come from unexpected teachers, and he was about to become one of them. It started with a simple drive to the grocery store. The future police commissioner was heading down Oak Street when he first noticed the patrol car in his rearview mirror. The black and white cruiser followed him for 3 blocks before the lights started flashing. He knew this moment would come eventually. He just didn't expect it so soon. Pulling over carefully, he followed all the proper procedures he taught countless times during his career. Hands on the steering wheel, engine off, quiet patience. Through his side mirror, he watched 2 officers approach, one on each side of his Honda Civic. Their hands rested casually on their holsters, a subtle intimidation tactic he recognized all too well. License and registration, the officer on the driver's side demanded, not bothering with the usual courtesies. His nameplate read Officer R, and his tone carried an edge of assumed authority. The future commissioner complied silently, movements slow and deliberate. He'd been on the other side of this scenario hundreds of times during his career. Now, experiencing it from this perspective, every detail felt different. "You know why we stopped you?" Officer R asked, shining his flashlight directly into the car, even though it was broad daylight. Before any answer could be given, his partner chimed in from the passenger side. "Your car matches a description we received." It was a classic line, one used too often without cause. The future commissioner knew there had been no such description. His car was possibly the most common vehicle on the road, a dark blue Honda Civic, practically identical to thousands of others. He stayed quiet, observing their tactics, mentally noting every procedural violation they were committing. Over the next 20 minutes, they ran his license, questioned his presence in the neighborhood, and made thinly veiled suggestions about how certain people didn't usually drive through this area. He answered each question calmly, documenting every word in his memory. His phone, sitting in the cup holder, quietly recorded the entire interaction. That stop was just the beginning. Over the next few days, the same two officers seemed to appear wherever he went. At the coffee shop, they'd park outside, watching. When he walked in the park, their cruiser would circle the block repeatedly. They were sending a message, marking their territory, demonstrating their power, or at least what they thought was their power. The harassment escalated gradually. One morning, he found a parking ticket on his windshield for being too close to the curb, a violation that didn't even exist in the local traffic code. Another day, they followed him all the way to the library, parking nearby and watching as he browsed books. Their presence was meant to be intimidating, but instead, it was providing him with perfect documentation of their behavior. Other officers started joining in, clearly following their colleagues' lead. What had begun as harassment from two officers evolved into a department-wide sport. They didn't realize they were writing their own disciplinary reports with every illegal stop, every baseless ticket, every random check. Through it all, he maintained his composure. During each encounter, he responded with perfect politeness, never revealing his true identity or position. He understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been targeted this way without the power to fight back. One particularly memorable afternoon, Officer R pulled him over again, this time claiming his brake light was out. The future commissioner had checked all his lights that very morning, a habit he'd developed since moving to town. As Officer R approached the car, his partner stayed back, conveniently positioning himself where his body camera wouldn't capture the interaction. "You're spending a lot of time in our town," Officer R said, his tone carrying an unspoken threat. "Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to be." The future commissioner simply smiled politely, knowing that very soon, these officers would learn a valuable lesson about prejudice and power. That evening, as he added the day's events to his growing file of documented incidents, he felt a mix of emotions. There was anger at the injustice, sadness for the community that had endured this treatment for so long, and determination to use his coming position to create real change. Soon, very soon, these officers would discover that their actions had consequences, and their new boss had experienced their true colors firsthand. The pattern became clearer with each passing day. What had started with two officers had spread like a virus through the department. The future commissioner watched from his apartment window as different patrol cars would park across the street, officers inside watching his comings and goings like hawks eyeing their prey. The local coffee shop owner, a friendly older man with kind eyes, pulled him aside one morning. "I've noticed what's happening," he whispered, glancing nervously at the police car parked outside. "They do this to folks they don't want around. Last month, it was the new family that moved in on Pine Street. Before that, It was the college student who opened the art studio. His words confirmed what the commissioner already knew. This wasn't just about him. Walking to his car one morning, he found a bright orange parking boot locked to his wheel. The violation notice claimed he had unpaid tickets he knew were bogus and had already contested. It took 4 hours at City Hall to get it removed, during which he carefully documented every conversation, every form, and every excuse they gave. At the park, where he often sat to write his observations, a group of teenagers approached him. They shared their own stories, how they couldn't hang out in certain areas without being questioned, how some officers would follow them home from school, how they'd learned to walk in pairs or groups for safety, not from criminals, but from those meant to protect them. The local grocery store became another hotspot for harassment. Every time he'd shop there, an officer would mysteriously appear, following him through the aisles, pretending to shop while keeping a not-so-subtle eye on his movements. One day, as he was loading groceries into his car, 2 officers approached, demanding to search his bags because they'd received a call about shoplifting. The store manager, watching from the doorway, shook his head in disgust, his notebook filled with patterns. Officer T worked Tuesday mornings and seemed to target people near the school. Officer L preferred the evening shift and focused on the area around the community center. Officer R, the one who'd started it all, appeared to have the most complaints from community members, though they were always mysteriously dismissed. The local diner became his sanctuary and source of information. Regular customers, seeing how he was treated, began sharing their experiences in hushed voices. A retired teacher spoke about her grandson being stopped 3 times in 1 week. A nurse described how officers would park outside the hospital during shift changes, targeting staff members who didn't look like they belonged. One rainy afternoon, he witnessed an elderly woman being questioned aggressively by 2 officers outside the library. She'd been sitting in her car, waiting for her granddaughter, when they demanded she explain her presence. The future commissioner recorded the incident discreetly, adding it to his growing collection of evidence. His apartment, once a simple temporary home, had transformed into an investigation headquarters. Maps covered one wall, marked with pushpins showing incident locations. His laptop contained folders of video recordings, written statements, and photographs. Each piece of evidence told part of a larger story of systematic harassment and abuse of power. The officers grew bolder, perhaps thinking their target would eventually break or leave town. They'd shine spotlights into his apartment at night, drive slowly past him while he walked down the street, or park outside places he visited until he left. What they didn't realize was that their increasing harassment only strengthened his resolve and provided more evidence of their misconduct. Through it all, he maintained his cover perfectly. To everyone in town, he was just another resident being targeted by overzealous officers. Even when the harassment reached its peak, with daily incidents and constant surveillance, he never let slip his true identity or purpose. Every ticket, every stop, every incident of harassment was another nail in the coffin of their careers, though they didn't know it yet. As the month drew closer to its end, he couldn't help but think about the upcoming revelation. These officers had no idea they'd been digging their own graves, professionally speaking. Their actions would soon come to light, and their behavior would be exposed not just to their new boss, but to the entire community they'd sworn to protect and serve. The breaking point came on a quiet Tuesday evening. The future commissioner had just finished dinner at the local diner when he noticed the now familiar patrol car trailing him. He knew what was coming. These stops had become almost routine, but this time felt different. There was a tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. The red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. He pulled over, going through the same motions he practiced dozens of times now. But as Officer R approached his window, something had changed. The usual smug confidence had been replaced by something darker, more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer R demanded, his hand resting heavily on his belt. The future commissioner complied calmly. though his heart raced. He'd seen this behavior before during his years in internal affairs. It was the stance of someone who felt untouchable, drunk on power. You just don't get the message, do you? Officer R's partner circled around, creating a wall of authority. People like you don't belong in this neighborhood. The words dripped with prejudice, each syllable carefully chosen to intimidate. The partner's body camera was conveniently turned off, a detail the future commissioner noted mentally. The search of his car was aggressive and unnecessary. They tossed his belongings onto the street, papers scattering in the evening breeze. A small crowd began to gather at a safe distance, watching silently, their faces showing a mixture of sympathy and resignation. This was clearly a scene they'd witnessed before. Found something interesting, Officer R announced, holding up a notebook. The future commissioner's pulse quickened. It was his documentation of their harassment. The officer flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each turn. Taking notes on police activity. That's suspicious behavior. What happened next would become the cornerstone of his future reforms. Officer R began a lengthy, hate-filled monologue, perhaps emboldened by weeks of unchecked power. Every word was captured by the commissioner's phone, still quietly recording in his pocket. The officer's prejudices spilled out, raw and uncensored, revealing the toxic culture that had infected the department. The future commissioner stood silently, watching his car being torn apart, listening to the stream of biased comments and thinly veiled threats. He thought about every person who'd shared their stories with him: the elderly woman at the library, the teenagers in the park, the nurse leaving her night shift. None of them had the power to stand up to this treatment. But he did. A young boy on a bicycle stopped to watch, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. The future commissioner caught his gaze, seeing in that child's face every reason why this system needed to change. This moment wasn't just about one bad traffic stop. It was about breaking a cycle of fear and abuse that had poisoned the community for far too long. After what felt like hours, they'd finally let him go, but not before Officer Ari delivered a final warning. Next time, we might have to take a different approach. The threat hung in the air like smoke, but instead of fear, the future commissioner felt a deep sense of purpose. They had finally shown their true colors, giving him exactly what he needed. That night, back in his apartment, he carefully transcribed every word from the recording. His hand shook slightly as he typed, not from fear, but from controlled anger and determination. This incident would become more than just another complaint to be filed away and forgotten. It would become the catalyst for real change. The neighbors who'd witnessed the scene stopped by to check on him. One brought him tea, another helped collect his scattered papers. Their small acts of kindness reinforced what he already knew. This community deserved better. As he looked at their concerned faces, he couldn't tell them that in just a few days, everything would change. That their silent suffering would finally have a voice. He spent the rest of the evening organizing his evidence. Every photo, every recording, every written account was carefully cataloged. Soon, very soon, Officer R and his colleagues would learn that their actions had consequences. But more importantly, this community would learn that justice wasn't just a word. It was a promise he intended to keep. After that night, the future commissioner knew it was time to dig deeper. His experience was just the tip of the iceberg. He needed to understand the full scope of what the community had endured. His background in internal affairs had taught him that patterns of behavior rarely existed in isolation. The local community center became his first stop. He arrived early one morning, just as people were gathering for their weekly senior breakfast club. The elderly residents were hesitant at first, but once one person started sharing, the stories flowed like a river breaking through a dam. A retired school bus driver described how officers would frequently follow his bus, making the children nervous. "They say it's for safety," he explained, stirring his coffee slowly, "but you can see the fear in the kids' eyes. That's not what safety looks like." At the youth basketball program, high school students shared their experiences. One young athlete explained how they changed their practice times because certain officers would park outside the gym, watching and sometimes following them home. The coach nodded silently, adding that attendance had dropped because parents were worried about their children being harassed. The owner of a small bakery near the police station provided another perspective. She showed him her security footage. Officers giving extra attention to certain customers, following them around the store, while completely ignoring others. "I've lost business," she confided, her voice barely a whisper. "People don't feel comfortable coming here anymore." He visited the local church after Sunday service, where the pastor introduced him to several families. Each had their own story. Traffic stops that lasted hours, noise complaints for children playing in their own backyards, mysterious tickets appearing on their windshields while they were in worship. The investigation led him to the town's only taxi driver, who had been keeping his own detailed records. "I see everything from my cab," he explained, showing a notebook filled with dates, times, and incident descriptions. Officers targeting the same people, the same neighborhoods, over and over. It's like they're playing some sick game. At the public library, the head librarian shared security footage, showing officers regularly parking outside, watching certain patrons enter and leave. She'd started extending library hours so people could wait until the patrol cars left before heading home. A group of college students studying at the local coffee shop opened up about their experiences. They'd created a buddy system for walking to classes, sharing locations with each other, and documenting every interaction with law enforcement. What should have been normal college life had become an exercise in survival strategies. The future commissioner spent an afternoon at the local park, watching kids play. Parents hovered nearby, their eyes constantly scanning for patrol cars. When one appeared, the playground would quickly empty, children being hurried away by worried adults. It was a heartbreaking dance of fear and power. He visited the community health clinic, where nurses spoke about patients missing important appointments because they were afraid of being stopped on the way. The clinic had started offering phone consultations, not because of COVID, but because of police harassment. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. He created a detailed map of incidents, noting patterns in timing and location. Certain officers' names kept appearing. R and his partner were frequent offenders, but they weren't alone. The behavior had become ingrained in the department's culture. What struck him most was the resilience of the community. Despite the constant harassment, people still looked out for each other. They'd developed warning systems, support networks, and ways to document the abuse. But they shouldn't have had to. Late one evening, as he reviewed his findings, a knock at his door startled him. It was the coffee shop owner, bringing him a fresh cup of coffee and a stack of customer statements. "We've been waiting for someone to listen," he said quietly. "Really listen." The evidence was overwhelming. Video recordings, photographs, written statements, official complaints that had been ignored or dismissed. It all painted a picture of systematic harassment and abuse of power. But more than that, it told the story of a community that had been silenced for too long. As he organized the final pieces of his investigation, the future commissioner felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. These weren't just cases or incidents. They were people's lives, their dignity, their right to feel safe in their own community. Soon, very soon, he would have the power to make things right. The morning of revelation arrived with a crisp autumn breeze. The future commissioner stood before his mirror, adjusting his perfectly pressed suit. Gone were the casual clothes and unassuming demeanor. Today, he would walk into the police station not as a target of harassment, but as their new boss. The precinct buzzed with its usual morning activity. Officers gathered for the daily briefing, coffee cups in hand, unaware that their world was about to turn upside down. Officer R and his partner stood near the back, sharing a joke, probably about their latest patrol activities. The police chief stood at the front of the room, clearing his throat. "As you all know, today we welcome our new commissioner." The room fell quiet, all eyes turning toward the door, expecting someone to walk in. Instead, the man they'd been harassing for the past month stood up from his seat in the corner. The transformation was stunning. His posture had changed, radiating authority and confidence. The casual observer they'd dismissed was gone, replaced by someone whose presence commanded immediate respect. The coffee cup he'd been holding hit the floor with a soft thud, spilling across the linoleum, but no one moved to clean it up. Officer R's face drained of color. His partner took an involuntary step backward, bumping into the wall. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as their new commissioner walked to the front of the room, each step echoing in the stunned silence. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I believe many of you know me already, though perhaps not in the way you expected." He pulled out his phone, playing a recording of Officer R's voice from their last encounter. The words, filled with prejudice and threats, echoed through the suddenly airless room. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, some looking at their feet, others stealing glances at Officer R, who stood frozen, his usual swagger replaced by visible fear. The partner had developed a sudden interest in studying the ceiling tiles. Over the past month, the commissioner continued, "I've had the unique opportunity to experience firsthand how this department treats certain members of our community." He began pulling out files, photographs, transcripts, video recordings. And not just me. I'd spoken with hundreds of citizens who shared similar experiences. One by one, he laid out the evidence on the table. The illegal stops, the baseless tickets, the intimidation tactics, all meticulously documented. Some officers in the room had the decency to look ashamed. Others seemed to be calculating their retirement options. "But today isn't about punishment," he announced, surprising everyone. "It's about transformation." He walked around the room, making eye contact with each officer. "You all took an oath to protect and serve. Today, we begin honoring that oath properly." The tension in the room shifted. What they'd expected to be an execution had become something else, an opportunity. The commissioner pulled out another set of files, these containing his plans for departmental reform, community engagement programs, and comprehensive retraining. "Each of you has a choice to make," he explained, his voice now carrying the note of hope. "You can be part of the solution, help rebuild trust with our community, and become the officers you swore to be. Or you can find another line of work." Officer R, who'd spent weeks trying to intimidate this man, now couldn't meet his gaze. His partner had somehow managed to shrink several inches in height, desperately trying to become invisible against the back wall. The commissioner's final words hung in the air like a promise and a warning. "Starting today, things change. Not because I'm your boss, but because it's right. Because every person in this community deserves to feel safe, respected, and protected by their police force." As he looked around the room, he saw different reactions: fear, shame, relief, and even hope. The power dynamic had shifted completely, but more importantly, the opportunity for real change had arrived. The badge that some had used as a weapon would now become a symbol of true service again. The morning briefing ended, but the real work was just beginning. As officers filed out, some already discussing the changes among themselves, the commissioner knew that this revelation was just the first step in a longer journey toward justice and redemption. The days following the revelation brought massive changes to the police department. The commissioner wasted no time implementing his reform program. His office, once a symbol of distant authority, now had an open-door policy. The same officers who had followed him around town were now following a very different kind of path. The first morning of training began early. Officers filed into the community center, a deliberate choice of location. The same building where citizens had shared their stories of harassment would now become a place of learning and change. Some officers sat stiffly in their chairs, while others nervously played with their notepads. Officer R and his partner sat in the front row, not by choice, but by the commissioner's specific request. "Today, the commissioner began, we're going to listen to some recordings." He played back the incidents of harassment, making officers confront their own words and actions. Some squirmed in their seats, Others looked down at their hands, but nobody left. Then came the surprise. The commissioner invited community members to share their experiences directly. The retired bus driver spoke about the children's fear. The bakery owner described her lost business. The college students explained their buddy system. With each story, the officers' expressions changed, from defensive to thoughtful, from dismissive to understanding. One particularly powerful moment came when a young boy, the same one who had watched the commissioner being harassed, stood up to speak. "I used to want to be a police officer," he said quietly, "but then I saw how you treated people who look like me." The silence in the room was deafening. Several officers removed their badges, staring at them as if seeing them for the first time. The training wasn't just about confronting past wrongs. The commissioner brought in experts on community policing, civil rights attorneys, and psychologists specializing in implicit bias. Each session was practical, focused on real situations and real solutions. Role-playing exercises put officers in the shoes of the citizens they'd harassed. Officer R, who had been the ringleader of the harassment, found himself paired with the coffee shop owner in one exercise. They had to work together to solve a community problem. At first, both were uncomfortable, but as they talked, something changed. The owner shared stories about his grandchildren, and Officer R opened up about his own family. By the end of the exercise, they were actually laughing together. The commissioner introduced a new patrol system. Officers who had stuck to their cars were now required to walk their beats. They had to visit local businesses, attend community events, and most importantly, listen to the people they served. The same streets they had once used to intimidate became places of connection and understanding. Body cameras became mandatory, with no exceptions. But more than that, officers had to review their footage weekly with community representatives. Having to explain and justify their actions to the very people they served created a new level of accountability. The partner who had always followed Officer R's lead found his own voice. During one training session, he stood up and shared how the culture of harassment had made him feel trapped. "I knew it was wrong," he admitted, "but I was afraid to speak up." His honesty opened the door for others to share similar feelings. Some officers resigned rather than adapt to the new standards. The commissioner accepted their resignations without comment. But for every officer who left, 3 community members applied to join the force. The department was gradually transforming to reflect the community it served. The commissioner established regular town halls where citizens could voice concerns directly to officers. The first few meetings were tense, but over time, real dialogue emerged. Officers who had once viewed certain neighborhoods with suspicion now knew residents by name, knew their stories, their struggles, and their dreams. At the end of the first month of reforms, the commissioner called a special meeting. The same room where he had revealed his true identity now held a very different group of officers. They sat straighter, looked people in the eye, and most importantly, listened with respect. Change, he told them, isn't just about new rules or procedures. It's about understanding that the power we hold is a responsibility, not a privilege. Every person we serve is someone's child, parent, or friend. They deserve nothing less than our best. Looking around the room, he saw something that hadn't been there before. Hope, not just in the officers' eyes, but in the eyes of the community members who had been invited to attend. The walls between police and community were slowly coming down, brick by brick, replaced by bridges of understanding and respect. Not everyone welcomed the changes in the police department. A core group of resistant officers, led by Officer R's old friends from the night shift, began pushing back. They weren't going to let their comfortable world of unchecked power slip away without a fight. It started with small acts of defiance. Reports would mysteriously go missing. Officers would arrive late to community engagement meetings. Some would deliberately patrol the wrong areas, avoiding the neighborhoods they were assigned to build relationships with. They thought they were being clever, but the commissioner had seen it all before. Anonymous complaints started appearing on the mayor's desk. Letters questioning the commissioner's methods, suggesting he was soft on crime and undermining police authority. They didn't realize that every complaint, every act of resistance, only proved how necessary these changes were. The police union representatives called an emergency meeting. They arrived at the commissioner's office with thick folders of grievances. "Our officers feel targeted," they claimed, without seeing the irony in their words. "This isn't how things are done here." The commissioner calmly opened his laptop and played a series of videos, footage of their own officers harassing innocent citizens. "Let's talk about how things were done here," he said quietly. The union reps shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as they watched their colleagues' behavior documented in high definition. One particularly vocal opponent was a senior officer who'd been with the department for 20 years. He tried rallying others against the new policies. "This isn't real police work," he'd complain in the break room. "Walking beats, talking to people, filling out detailed reports. It's a waste of time." Then something unexpected happened. This same officer was assigned to patrol the neighborhood near the community center. At first, he did it grudgingly, but then he met an elderly resident who reminded him of his own grandmother. She invited him in for coffee, shared stories about the neighborhood's history, and suddenly, waste of time became building trust. The resistant officers tried another tactic: statistics. They claimed crime would rise without their proactive policing methods. The commissioner responded by showing data from other cities where similar reforms had actually lowered crime rates while improving community relations. Some officers filed formal complaints about the body camera requirements, claiming they were too restrictive. The commissioner's response was simple. He wore one himself. "Every day, every interaction, all recorded. If I can do it," he told them, "so can you." The old guard tried spreading rumors in the community, suggesting the new policies were making the town less safe. But the community had seen the changes firsthand. They'd experienced the difference between being policed and being protected. The rumors fell flat. Officer R's former partner, who had initially resisted the changes, became an unexpected ally. During a tense department meeting, he stood up and shared how the new approach had changed his perspective. "I sleep better at night," he admitted. "For the first time in years, I'm proud to wear this badge." The resistance reached its peak when someone leaked personnel files to the local newspaper, trying to discredit the reform supporters. The commissioner called an emergency meeting. Instead of anger, he showed them more videos, not of misconduct this time, but of positive interactions between officers and citizens under the new policies. "This is who we can be," he told them. "This is who we should be." The leaked files backfired, as community members came forward to defend the officers who'd been targeted, sharing stories of their positive impact. Some of the most stubborn resistors found themselves won over by unexpected moments. One officer, after helping a group of kids fix their basketball hoop, realized this kind of police work felt better than harassment ever had. Another discovered that knowing people's names and stories made the job more meaningful than knowing their criminal records. The commissioner watched it all with patient determination. He knew from experience that real change takes time. The resistance wasn't just about policies or procedures. It was about changing hearts and minds, about helping officers rediscover why they'd chosen this profession in the first place. By the end of the third month, the resistance had largely faded. Not because it had been crushed, but because the evidence of positive change was undeniable. Crime rates were steady, community trust was growing, and officers were reporting higher job satisfaction. The old way of doing things was losing its appeal in the face of real progress. Looking out over the town from his office window, the commissioner allowed himself a small smile. The resistance had actually strengthened the reforms by proving how necessary they were. Sometimes, he realized, the strongest opposition creates the most lasting change. 6 months had passed since that first morning of revelation. The town hall was packed for the community meeting, not with angry protesters or worried citizens, but with people eager to share their stories of change. The same room that had once held tense confrontations now buzzed with positive energy. The coffee shop owner stood up first, his voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I had to warn certain customers when police cars were outside, he said. Now officers come in for coffee and actually talk with people. My business has doubled, and not just because of the police sweet tooth. Gentle laughter rippled through the room. A young teenager, the one who'd once said he'd lost his dream of becoming an officer, raised his hand. I joined the Youth Police Academy last month, he announced proudly. The officers there actually listen to us. They teach us about our rights, not just about following rules. Several officers in the room nodded, genuine smiles on their faces. Even Officer R had a story to share. Standing up, his usual arrogance replaced by humility, he spoke about his journey. I used to think power meant making people fear us, he admitted. Now I understand. Real power is earning their trust. He looked at the commissioner, who gave him an encouraging nod. The transformation was visible in the small things. Officers knew people's names, their stories, their struggles. They helped elderly residents with groceries, played basketball with kids after school, and attended community events not as security, but as neighbors. The retired bus driver shared how the school route had changed. The kids wave at police cars now, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They're not scared anymore. That's worth more than any statistics or reports. Crime rates had shifted too, but not in the way the critics had predicted. With community trust growing, people were more willing to report problems, share information, and work with officers to prevent crimes before they happened. Real police work, it turned out, was about building relationships. The bakery owner brought before and after pictures of her security cameras. Before, they showed empty streets because people were afraid to come around, she explained. Now they show a community alive and thriving. And yes, officers still patrol, but they stop to chat, not to harass. One of the most powerful moments came when a former critic of the reform stood up. She'd been vocal about her skepticism, worried that softer policing would make the town less safe. I was wrong, she said simply. Our community isn't just safer, it's stronger. The commissioner watched it all from the back of the room, letting others take center stage. This was their victory too. Every person in that room had contributed to the change, whether by sharing their stories, giving the new approach a chance, or simply believing that things could be better. The local newspaper editor presented 6 months of headlines. The story of transformation told in black and white, from police department under fire to community policing success story. The journey was there for all to see. Near the end of the meeting, something unexpected happened. The partner who had once followed Officer R's lead in harassment introduced a new community outreach program, his own initiative. We're starting a mentorship program, he announced. Officers partnering with local kids, helping with homework, sports, whatever they need. The commissioner finally took the podium, but not to give a speech. Instead, he handed out awards, not to officers, but to community members who had helped make the changes possible. The coffee shop owner, the retired bus driver, the brave teenagers who had shared their stories, each received recognition for their role in the transformation. 6 months ago, he concluded, I showed you evidence of what was wrong. Today, you've shown everyone what can be right. This isn't the end of our journey, it's just the beginning. As people mingled after the meeting, sharing refreshments and stories, the commissioner noticed something profound. Officers and citizens weren't standing in separate groups anymore. They were mixed together, laughing, talking, planning future projects. The invisible wall that had divided the community had finally crumbled. Looking around the room, he saw not just a changed police department, but a transformed community. The badges his officers wore now symbolized something real, not power over people, but power with them. The town had become what every community should be, a place where protection meant service, where authority meant responsibility, and where blue uniforms represented trust rather than fear.